Some marriages end in shouting, others end in silence, and sometimes, silence is what scares the most. Before understanding what happened between Claire and Richard, you need to understand how that marriage got there. They had been together for 13 years. In the beginning, everything seemed ordinary. They met at a friend's birthday party, started dating, fell in love quickly, and within a few years, they were already sharing an apartment. For a long time, they were seen as a stable couple. No big fights, no scandals. But there was a detail that almost no one noticed. The silence between them began to grow. First came the small things, conversations that became shorter, plans that stopped being made together, dinners where both spent more time looking at their cell phones than at each other. Then came the days, and then came the months. They continued living in the same house, sleeping in the same bed. But they were no longer living the same life. Claire felt it. She had felt it for a long time. For 2 years, she tried to ignore the feeling. She tried to convince herself that it was just a phase. But there was something she couldn't deny. Their marriage seemed to be stuck, as if they were both waiting for something to happen. Until on an ordinary Tuesday, Claire decided she needed to say out loud what had been implied for a long time. They were sitting in the kitchen, the same table as always, the same silence as always. She took a deep breath and said, "I think we need to get a divorce." She was prepared for any reaction, except for the one that came. Richard looked up from his glass of water, thought for a few seconds. All right, just that. No argument, no questions, no attempt to change the decision. And it was exactly at that moment that Claire began to suspect something was very wrong. Claire stood still looking at Richard for a few seconds. She wasn't sure if she had heard correctly. For weeks, maybe months, she had imagined what that moment would be like. She thought of long arguments, of accusations, maybe even tears. 13 years of marriage don't end with a single sentence, or at least, they shouldn't. All right? She repeated, trying to understand. Richard gave a small sigh, rested his elbows on the table, and replied with the same calmness, "If that's what you want, Claire. All right." That didn't seem normal. No questions, no why, no, let's try to work it out. It was as if he had already accepted the idea. Claire felt a strange discomfort growing inside her chest. It wasn't regret. It was something harder to explain. It was the feeling that she was late to a conversation that Richard had already had by himself. In the following days, everything happened fast. Richard contacted a lawyer, gathered documents, separated accounts, organized the necessary papers for the divorce as if he were solving something routine. No drama, no tension. Without even mentioning the subject again. Claire observed everything closely. Something about that behavior made no sense. Even in marriages that end badly, there is some kind of emotion. Anger, frustration, sadness. But Richard seemed too calm. One night, while organizing some documents in the living room, Claire decided to ask directly, "Aren't you going to try to make me change my mind?" Richard looked up from the papers, thought for a second, and replied, "No, just that." There was no explanation. He went back to looking at the documents as if the matter were closed. But that night, while Claire tried to sleep, a thought began to bother her. What if he already knew this was going to happen? The idea seemed absurd, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense, because his reaction didn't seem like surprise. It seemed like preparation. And Claire still didn't know that a discovery made days later would prove that suspicion wasn't paranoia. Richard really was prepared, long before she asked for the divorce. In the following days, the divorce process began to move forward. Everything was happening fast. Too fast. Richard organized documents with almost mechanical efficiency, separated accounts, answered emails from the lawyer, signed papers. Without complaining, without questioning, without even showing that it was affecting him. To anyone looking from the outside, it seemed like the ideal scenario. A civilized divorce, mature, No fighting. But Claire couldn't feel relief. Something inside her said there was something wrong with that story. One night, while organizing old documents to send to the lawyer, Claire opened a desk drawer in Richard's office. She wasn't looking for anything specific. Just old papers, invoices, bank statements, until she found a manila envelope. Inside was a contract, a lease agreement. Claire frowned. Richard's name was there. She started reading carefully, and then she noticed something that made her heart race. The date. The contract had been signed 3 months earlier. 3 months before she asked for the divorce. Claire reread the sheet several times, trying to understand if she was misinterpreting it. But no, it was clear. Richard had already rented an apartment, long before she mentioned any separation. She sat in the chair, feeling a chill run down her spine. Why? If he didn't know she would ask for a divorce, why was he preparing to leave? And if he did know, how? Claire kept looking at the document. That's when she noticed another detail. The address. The apartment wasn't in the same neighborhood, nor in the same region. In fact, not even in the same city. And at that moment, a question began to form in her mind. A question that would completely change the way she saw that marriage. Richard was preparing to leave. But from what exactly? Claire stared at the contract for several minutes. The paper trembled slightly in her hands. It made no sense. Richard had rented an apartment 3 months earlier. And it wasn't just a temporary apartment. The contract was for a year. She reread the address one more time. Another city, almost 2 hours from there. That didn't look like an improvised plan. It looked like a life change. Claire tried to remember any recent conversation that could explain that. A serious argument, some threat of separation. But nothing came to mind. In the last few months, their marriage had been quiet, distant, but not explosive. There was no big fight. There was no specific event. Just the slow wear and tear that seemed to have taken over the relationship. Even so, something didn't fit. If Richard was planning to leave even before she asked for the divorce, then he already expected it to happen. Or worse, maybe he was also planning to leave. Claire closed the envelope slowly. That night, she decided not to say anything. She wanted to observe. She wanted to better understand what was happening. At dinner, Richard seemed exactly as always. Calm, polite, too peaceful. They ate in silence like so many other times. But now Claire observed his every gesture with attention. The way he answered messages on his cell phone. The way he avoided talking about the future. And mainly the serenity with which he handled the divorce. That didn't look like resignation. It looked like relief. And that's when Claire started to wonder something she had never considered before. What if Richard also wanted to get out of that marriage? More than that. What if he had already accepted the end long before her? But there was something that still bothered her. Because if he was preparing to leave, why didn't he ever say anything? And the answer to that question would start to appear a few days later. When Claire found something even stranger among his things. Something that indicated Richard wasn't just moving. He was starting over. In the following days, Claire couldn't stop thinking about the lease agreement. The discovery had changed everything. Now his every gesture seemed to carry a hidden meaning. Every silence seemed planned. She began to pay attention to details she had previously ignored. Richard was arriving later from work, spending more time on his cell phone. And curiously, he seemed to be organizing several personal things. One afternoon, while he was still out, Claire decided to finish separating some old documents. At the bottom of a blue folder, she found something that made her stomach tighten. It was a set of forms. Resumes, copies of documents, and several printed emails. She began to read, and then she realized something surprising. Richard wasn't just renting an apartment. He was looking for work in another city. He had exchanged messages with companies, participated in online interviews, sent out resumes, everything organized with dates, notes, and replies. Claire leafed through the papers slowly. That wasn't an emergency plan. It was a complete relocation project. He was preparing a new life, a new job, a new city, maybe a new beginning. And he did all this without saying a single word, without arguing, without threatening to leave, without even showing he was thinking of going away. Claire felt a strange mix, confusion, anger, but also something unexpected, curiosity, because if Richard was planning all that in silence, then there was something she didn't know, something that had happened before all this began, something that might explain why he seemed so calm about the divorce. That night, while Richard was taking a shower, Claire decided to look at one last thing on his computer, something that could clarify everything. She opened the email history and found a specific message, a message sent months earlier. After reading it, Claire realized she might have understood everything wrong. Maybe Richard wasn't simply accepting the divorce. Maybe he was just waiting for her to be the first to say what they both already knew. But the true reason behind that wait was even deeper. Claire hesitated for a few seconds before opening the email. Part of her knew that was an invasion of privacy, but another part needed to understand. She needed to know why Richard seemed so prepared for the end of the marriage. She opened the message. It was an email sent to an old friend of his, Mark. The date immediately caught her attention. Almost 4 months before she asked for the divorce. Claire began to read. At first, it seemed like an ordinary conversation. Richard asked about job opportunities in the city where Mark lived. He commented on the market in the region, spoke about some companies. But then came a passage that made Claire stop. Richard had written, "I think the marriage is over. It's just that neither of us has had the courage to admit it yet." Claire felt her chest tighten. She continued reading. There was no big fight, nothing dramatic. Just silence. More and more silence. Sometimes it feels like we're just waiting for someone to say it out loud. Her hands began to tremble slightly. Richard continued in the email. "I don't blame Claire. We just got lost along the way. I think we both know that, but we're postponing the moment." Claire leaned back in the chair. That didn't sound like anger. It didn't sound like resentment. It sounded like resignation. She looked back at the screen. The last sentence of the email was isolated on one line. "If she asks for a divorce, I won't argue. Maybe it's the only way for us to finally move on." Claire stared at those words for a long time. Suddenly, many things began to make sense. The silence, the calm, the lack of surprise. Richard wasn't being indifferent. He just had already accepted it, long before her. But there was something at the end of that email that Claire hadn't noticed yet. A small sentence, almost lost. And when she finally read that last line, she felt a chill run through her whole body. Because Richard had written something that completely changed the meaning of everything. Something she never imagined hearing from him. And that raised a new question. Was he really leaving just because of the marriage? Or was there another reason she didn't know yet? Claire turned her eyes back to the screen. She had almost closed the email when she noticed that last line. It was short, discreet, but different from the rest of the message. Richard had written, "Maybe leaving is the only way not to turn respect into resentment." Claire read that sentence twice, then 3 times. Respect into resentment. That didn't sound like the sentence of someone who was running away. It sounded like the sentence of someone who was trying to prevent something worse from happening. She leaned back in her chair and began to think about everything that had happened in the last few years. The arguments that never quite exploded, the conversations that were left half-finished, the silences that became routine. Maybe Richard wasn't simply accepting the divorce. Maybe he was trying to preserve something. Dignity. The respect that still remained between them. Claire realized something uncomfortable at that moment. For a long time, she believed she was the only one who felt the marriage was ending. But now it seemed clear that Richard had noticed long before. And instead of fighting it, he had started preparing, in silence, without accusing, without confronting, without pressuring. His strategy was simple. Wait. Wait until Claire said what they both already knew. But there was still something Claire didn't understand. Because preparing for a new job and a new apartment in another city was more than accepting the end of a marriage. It was starting a new life. And no one starts a new life like that. Without a reason. Claire closed the email slowly. At that moment, she realized something she had never considered before. Maybe she didn't know Richard anymore. Maybe she hadn't known him for a long time. And there was only one way to find out what was really happening. She needed to ask directly. But the answer she would hear in that conversation would completely change the way she viewed that divorce. That night, Claire could hardly sleep. The words of the email kept coming back to her mind. Maybe leaving is the only way not to turn respect into resentment. She tried to remember when was the last time she really talked to Richard. Not about bills, not about house chores, but about what they felt. She couldn't remember. The next morning, Richard was in the kitchen making coffee, as he did every day. The routine seemed exactly the same, but for Claire, everything had changed. She sat at the table, stayed in silence for a few seconds. Richard noticed. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Claire took a deep breath. "I found the apartment contract." Richard stopped stirring the spoon in the coffee. The silence that followed wasn't of surprise. It was of confirmation. He placed the cup on the table and sat in front of her. "I figured you'd find it at some point." That made Claire feel a knot in her chest. "You were already planning to leave before I asked for the divorce," she said. Richard nodded slowly, without denying it, without trying to explain immediately. Claire continued, "Why?" The question hung in the air for a few seconds. Richard rested his arms on the table and looked directly at her. There was no anger in his gaze, no guilt either, just exhaustion. "Because I realized that we had both already left, long before admitting it." The sentence was simple, but heavy. Claire felt the impact. "So you gave up?" she asked. Richard shook his head. "No. I just stopped pretending that we were still trying." His sincerity was uncomfortable, because deep down, Claire knew there was truth there. But there was something that still didn't make sense. "And why didn't you ever say anything?" Richard took a few seconds before answering. When he finally spoke, his answer was even more unexpected. "Because I knew you needed to be the first to say it." Claire frowned. "Why?" Richard took a deep breath. And then he said something she had never considered. Something that would completely change the way she saw that silence. Richard was silent for a few seconds before answering. He seemed to choose his words carefully, not like someone trying to defend himself, but like someone trying to be fair. "Because if I were the first to say it, you would always think I gave up on us," he explained. Claire didn't answer. She just listened. Richard continued. "And I didn't want you to carry that doubt." She frowned slightly. "What doubt?" Richard rested his hands on the table. "The doubt that maybe there was still something to save." The sentence fell like a weight. Claire stared at him, trying to understand. "So you just waited?" she asked. Richard nodded. "I waited until I was sure we were both seeing the same thing." He paused briefly. "When you asked for the divorce, I realized we had finally arrived." There was no accusation in his voice, no resentment, just a kind of quiet acceptance. "That's why you didn't argue," said Claire, almost in a whisper. Richard gave a small, sad smile. "Argue why?" He continued. "I didn't want to win an argument. I wanted the decision to be honest." Claire felt something tighten inside her chest, because for the first time in a long time that conversation seemed real. No defenses, no masks. "And the move?" she asked. "The job? The apartment?" Richard looked at his coffee cup for a few seconds before answering. I needed to start over. Claire felt an unexpected pang. It wasn't anger. It was something harder to name. That far away? She asked. Richard looked up. Sometimes, to start over, we need to leave the place where we learned to lose ourselves. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences they had in recent years. It wasn't empty. It was understanding. But that conversation wasn't over yet. Because there was something Claire needed to say before that chapter of their lives truly closed. Something that perhaps had arrived too late. Claire was silent for a few seconds. The coffee on the table was already cold. For the first time in a long time, they were having a real conversation. No accusations, no defenses. Just two people finally saying what they had kept inside for years. Claire took a deep breath. Maybe we should have had this conversation sooner. Richard agreed with a small nod. Maybe, but he didn't say it with regret. He said it with the calmness of someone who has already accepted the past. Claire looked around the kitchen, the house where they lived so many years, the walls that witnessed laughter, plans, dreams, and also silences. Are you angry with me? She asked. Richard thought for a few seconds before answering. No. He paused. I just think we took a long time to admit what was already clear. Claire looked down. Because deep down, she knew that was true. They hadn't ended on that Tuesday. Their marriage had ended bit by bit. In the days when they chose not to talk. In the nights when they pretended everything was fine. In the moments when silence seemed easier than the truth. Richard got up from the table, picked up the empty cup. I'm leaving next month, he said. Claire felt a brief tightness in her chest. Not because she wanted to stop him, but because now she understood that it was final. I hope you find what you're looking for, she said. Richard looked at her for a moment. I hope so too. He paused briefly before adding, for both of us. At that moment, Claire realized something that perhaps had taken years to understand. Some relationships don't end because someone did something wrong. They end because two people change. And when that happens, insisting sometimes only turns affection into weariness. Richard didn't argue about the divorce, not because he didn't care, but because he had already understood something that Claire was only beginning to notice. Some goodbyes aren't made with shouting. They happen in silence, at the moment when two gazes finally recognize the same truth, that the love that existed there had already been gone for a long time. Some relationships don't end with fights. They don't end with slamming doors or with harsh words. Sometimes they end much earlier, in the silence that grows between two people who no longer know how to find each other. Claire and Richard's story isn't about who was right or wrong. It's about something that happens in many relationships. Two people who loved each other, but who started walking in different directions. And when that happens, there's a difficult question that almost no one wants to ask. Are we still trying, or just waiting for the moment to admit it's over? Richard didn't argue about the divorce. Not because he didn't care, but because he had already understood something that Claire only realized later. Some goodbyes don't need shouting. They happen when two people finally have the courage to accept the same truth. And maybe this story leaves an important reflection. Sometimes the problem isn't when love ends. The problem is when two people stay together, even knowing deep down that they are no longer in the same place. If this story made you reflect, or if at some point you identified with this situation, leave your comment below. I want to know your opinion. Was Richard right to accept the divorce without arguing? Like the video, because that helps this story reach more people. Share it with someone who needs to hear this reflection today. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that show the deeper side of human relationships. Because here, we tell stories that seem simple, but that reveal truths that many people live, and almost no one speaks about. See you in the next video.